It's hard to work out if it's getting more shady in here or just becoming a giant polytunnel. We've got the rafters to go on. Well, we haven't. We've got the timber to cut the rafters from. I've done a little bit of messing around up there to try and get them right. We want to make sure that we can get one as a good template, and then hopefully everything will run parallel. First thing I need to do is sort out this OSB. Right, so I kind of know my test rafter sits okay here. I'm going to move it along halfway just to make sure things are where they're meant to be. Alright, third time lucky. Made up my template. It's taken a little bit of playing around. It's now sitting down nicely. The main problem, I think, is the fact that we're trying to match up with the trusses. If we didn't have to match up with the trusses and we just wanted all the rafters to be the same, I could have done this in a different way. I could have just used a guide and measured it, you know, without even using a tape measure. Because we're trying to get it spot on and all of our purlins will carry on over the top, it needed to be bang on where we needed it. So, I've got one. I'm going to cut 10, which will give me enough, I think, for this side of the building. In theory, they should be a mirror image of each other. We'll use the last of those 10 to test the other side. If it's all good, then we'll rattle them all off. Are you ready to pick up my sawdust in your hair? I'll give you a very quick look at how I was doing it. Basically, I knew that I needed to come up 15 mil, and I knew my roof is 12.7 degrees. So you can pretty much work out everything from just using the speed square. So just by tilting it across like this, I can see that when we get to 12.5 degrees is quite obvious, so I'm kind of going to there. That would give me my plumb cut if I was doing that. And then the distance across our wall plate. Now, because of the dimensions of the timber and the fact that it has to match the pitch, I'm not sitting on the whole wall plate, it's 70 mil. That was just because of the dimensions of the timber and things like that, and I knew that from SketchUp. We can go across there, and that, I mean, this is a tiny, tiny little bird's mouth. That is a right angle, so we can kind of double check it. And now we're going to use this as a template. But before we get too much further, I think we need to mark up all of our spots for the rafters. And I've gone back, because our last truss didn't fall 600 centres, I've gone back 2 trusses to carry that on. Well, we do pick a hot day. Whew. We are on the home straight now as far as getting the roof on. 3 more rafters to cut for this end. We've got our template, fortunately. The template from this side was a mirror image of this side, so nothing has been slowing down that way. Let me just show you something we did have to do. Up on the wall plate here, we ended up bringing our insulation board right to the top. Still got to be screwed and battened in. But we just gone in and notched out where the rafter sits. Obviously it notches over there. And then all these are ready to screw down now. And then this end where we've got all of our trusses is a different story. We've got insulation to do before we can get the membrane and the roofing on. So we're going to end up putting our vapor barrier and battens from underneath and then roll our insulation in from above, and hopefully that's going to work out okay. And then we're going to get a bit of organisation in here ready for fitting out internal walls. But before we can do that, we need to finish these rafters. We are officially done on rafters. Finish off by bracing it all to make sure that all of our centres are the same. Some of these are twisted in the heat a little bit. But next job will be to membrane and batten the top, ready for our roofing sheets. They've just arrived, so there's nothing stopping us cracking on with this week and getting the whole thing closed in. Right, it's another hot scorcher of a day, so we made an early start. What we're going to do is continue with our rafters that we got up. We want to brace them because they're less than 3 meters from our ridge down to the wall plate. But so I don't really want to have any noggins or anything just interrupting it, because obviously we want airflow and it's just better for insulation to not have that. But there is a tendency for them to twist a little bit, so we're going to put a bit of bracing on underneath, and then later on today, if we get that far, we'll have the membrane on, and then we've got some quite chunky battens where they're more like purlins to carry our sheet roofing. Now we're sorting out a problem that a couple of you may have spotted in the last video. When I put, I'm not going to share the blame, it's not Craig's fault, he wasn't even here. When I put the clips on for the trusses, stuck them on the top of the wall plate. They couldn't really go on the outside, especially on the external walls because of the wood fibre sheathing. They could have gone on the inside, ideally before the OSB went on. However, just for belts and braces, we snipped the wings off a few of those clips, folded them up and putting a second one in. So these are definitely going nowhere. I'm not going to do it on every one, be a bit overkill. It's a bit easier down the other end. We've fixed those in temporarily. They're not going to budge anywhere. Then we can put the clips underneath, fix them in. And then up on the ridge, we've put 4 nails in, skew nailed. And we've also got a clip that goes over the top. So I'm not going to be putting truss clips underneath, simply because most of that beam is going to remain exposed. Now I'm going to mention one other thing, because some of you may have spotted that. We intentionally, the plumb cut, which is the top of the rafters where it comes down onto the ridge, is intentionally not plumb. As you can see, we just set it back about 1 degree or so, just to make sure that when we put the buildings together, that it's not the top ridge that touches first. I'd much rather these beams come in nice and tight, because obviously that's going to be visible from the underside, and all of those central walls need to be tight before anything else touches. Right folks, we are going to make some progress today. Hopefully we're going to get the vapor barrier in, and we're going to get insulation in, and it's the hottest day of the week. First up, we're going to be looking at getting our vapor barrier up on the ceiling. Yes, our walls are breathable, and we've gone fully natural that way, but really with a metal roof going on here, it's just nice to have that layer, and also knowing that we're nice and airtight, no drafts coming through. So we're going to be putting that up first, and then counter battening underneath. What that means is we can go up on the scaffolding and lie all of our insulation in, and then get our roof on. You imagine it in a big loft trusses in a house, you'd be able to get up in there to insulate. We need to insulate before we put the roof on. Hence why it's a nice dry day, probably one of the hottest days of the year to be insulating, but we're going to do it anyway. It's hard to work out if it's getting more shady in here or just becoming a giant polytunnel. It's going okay. There's a little bit more play in this than there is in a breather membrane, where if you start going off it puckers up, and we can kind of keep this taut. The main issue is when we put the insulation in, of course it's going to sit down a bit. It doesn't really matter. I think all the lighting that's going in here is that stuff that's only 12mm deep anyway, the downlights, it's the low voltage stuff. So now we've been juggling around with it above our heads. Should be a little bit easier. We've temporarily propped it up this side. We've got a spacing batten now which is 550, which means that these will end up at 600 from now on, which means our plasterboard can just run straight in. We've then got the option of plasterboard in the whole building before we put our internal walls up, just so in the future we've got options to move things around. Either that, or we may just be able to put our internal walls up first, and then we can run first fix over the top of the stud wall anyway. Well, as you can see, we now have everything sheeted out and battened on this side at least. Podge is now officially wrapped and ready. Well, it's kind of wet, it's not wet tight, it's all been with a pond above our roof. But the kind of concept has now been improved. We've got battens ready for plasterboard. Next stage is to do exactly the same on Hodge on the next half. It's mighty hot. We're basically now creating polytunnels in the cabin. Tomorrow we'll get the insulation rolled out and the membrane on the roof, and fingers crossed that's going to make it cooler in here rather than just creating an oven. We should be then keeping the heat out. Now up here on this side, where the trusses transition to our pitched ceiling, we have a flat triangle section. We need to insulate that off on the top, on the other side, but we will carry up this vapor barrier to the ceiling, and then when it hits that pitched ceiling, this section here, we are actually going to use up those foil insulation boards which we bought right back in February. We decided not to use them for the walls because we want to stick with natural insulations, but these rafters, being 150mm deep, really don't leave enough depth for sheep's wool, mineral wool, or anything like that. And the glass, sorry, and the wood fibre boards, we could look at using them on top of the roof, but it just makes things a little bit heavier. Plus also the top of our roof needs to be the same, carrying from that end through to here. So we would have had to think about making these a lot lower to match that end. Anyway, Long story short, we're going to insulate between these with just gaffer tape and PIR, which should be nice and simple. We'll then insulate below them as well, which will give us a thermal break. Then we'll have a plasterboard and possibly even some infrared heating mats in the ceiling hidden in there.